She looked at my hands before she looked at my face. That's the part I still think about. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of day in British Columbia, where the mountains disappear behind cloud, and everything smells like wet cedar and coming rain. I dropped Liam off at school 40 minutes early because his science project was due and he'd forgotten to print 3 pages, and I'd sat in the parking lot of the school with the engine running, watching the other parents in their clean cars, and I remember thinking that I needed new wiper blades before the real rain started. I was 39 years old. I ran a small carpentry and renovation business out of a white Chevy work van with a dent on the passenger side I kept meaning to fix. The van had 160,000 kilometers on it and smelled like wood shavings and the coffee I spilled on the seat in 2021. I had 7 clients that month. I had a 9-year-old son who collected hockey cards and was terrified of thunderstorms and made the best scrambled eggs I'd ever tasted. I had a mortgage that made my chest tight every time I thought about it too long. And I had, in that van, a crumpled voicemail I'd written on the back of a Tim Hortons receipt because I didn't want to forget the address. The call had come the night before, a woman named Estelle, the personal assistant of someone called Helena Voss. She'd said the name like I was supposed to know it. When I Googled it that night after Liam was in bed, I understood why. Helena Voss was the kind of name that appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. She was the widow of Raymond Voss, who'd built half the resource infrastructure in northern BC in the 70s and 80s. There were profile pieces about her in the Globe and Mail. There was a photo of her standing outside a glass building in Vancouver, wearing a coat that probably cost more than my van. Estelle had told me that a piano needed restoration work, an old Steinway concert grand. It had been sitting in the estate in West Vancouver for years, unplayed. Someone had recommended me. She didn't say who. She asked if I was available to come and assess it. I almost said no. I almost said I was busy, because I was, and because West Vancouver wasn't my usual territory, and because I had a healthy kind of instinct that told me jobs that start with personal assistance usually end with headaches. But then I thought about the wiper blades, and the mortgage, and I said yes. The gate at the end of the driveway was black iron, the kind that opens slowly and deliberately, like it wants you to feel it. The property was set back from the road, up a long private lane flanked by Douglas firs so tall they made the sky feel smaller. The house itself appeared gradually, the way large things do, piece by piece through the trees until suddenly it was all there. A massive stone and glass structure, perched above the water, with the kind of view that makes you stop walking for a second, even when you're trying to act professional. I parked behind a Mercedes I'd never be able to afford and sat in the van for a moment, looking at my clipboard and trying to remember that I was good at what I did. A woman in her 60s met me at the door. She introduced herself as Estelle. She was polished in the way of people who have spent decades managing other people's worlds, efficient, watchful, not unkind, but not warm. She led me through a foyer with a ceiling I had to tilt my head back to see, past a staircase that curved like a sentence, and into a room at the back of the house that looked out over the water. The piano was there. It was enormous. A Steinway Model D, concert grand, ebony cabinet, almost 3 meters long. It sat near the windows facing Burrard Inlet, and even in its neglected state, even dusty and out of tune and clearly not touched in years, there was something about it that stopped you. Something about the scale of it, the weight, the way it occupied space. Like it had always been there and always would be. I set my bag down and walked toward it slowly. That was when she came in. I heard her before I saw her. Not her footsteps, the room was carpeted near the door. More of a presence, the way the air in a room changes when someone walks into it with certainty. I turned and she was standing near the doorway and she was looking at my hands. Not my face, my hands. Helena Voss was in her mid-70s, I guessed. She was tall, or had been, carrying herself now with the careful posture of someone who was once very tall. Her hair was white and pulled back. She wore no jewelry except a ring on her right hand. She had the kind of face that had been striking once and had settled into something more severe with age, not unpleasant, but exact, like a city that had been rebuilt after a fire. She looked at my hands, at the calluses and the stain along my right index finger from the linseed oil I'd been working with that week, and then she looked at my face, and she said, with a tone that was not a question, "You're younger than I expected." I told her I was 39. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Raymond was 39 when he bought this piano," she said. "He thought it made him seem like a serious person." She looked back at the Steinway. "He never learned to play." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the right answer. She asked me to tell her what I could see. Not what was wrong with it, what I could see. That was an unusual thing to ask. Most clients want a quote within the first 5 minutes. They want to know what it costs and how long it takes and whether you can start Monday. Helena Voss wanted to know what I could see. So I looked. I really looked. I told her about the veneer lifting at the corners of the lid, consistent with low humidity exposure, probably over several winters. I told her about the minor cracking in the case near the treble end, surface level, nothing structural. I told her the bench had been replaced. At some point, the hardware didn't match the original period. I told her the ivory on a few of the lower keys had chipped and would need to be sourced carefully because real ivory wasn't legal anymore, and the replacements had to match in weight and feel. I crouched down and looked at the legs and told her the left rear leg had been shimmed at some point, maybe to compensate for an uneven floor, and whoever had done it hadn't been a craftsman. She was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she said, "The tuner we had in 6 years ago told me it was beyond repair, that it would cost more than it was worth." I stood up and I looked at the piano and I said, "He was wrong." She looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in her face. Not much, just a small movement around the eyes. Then she turned and walked back toward the door and said over her shoulder, "Come back Saturday, I'll have Estelle show you the service records." That was it. No please, no thank you, no confirmation of rate or timeline. She just left. I stood in that room for another minute after she'd gone, with the light coming off the water and the sound of the rain starting on the glass, and I looked at the piano, and I thought about the shimmed leg and the mismatched bench, and I thought that someone had cared about this instrument once. Someone had brought it here and set it in front of this view for a reason, and somewhere along the way it had been left to gather dust and be told it was beyond saving. I drove home in the rain with the wipers streaking and Liam's science project folder on the passenger seat and a kind of feeling I couldn't entirely name. I came back Saturday. I came back the Saturday after that. By the 3rd week, I had a system. I'd arrive at 8, Estelle would let me in, and I'd work until early afternoon before I had to pick Liam up. Helena Voss was sometimes in the house and sometimes not. When she was, she would appear at some point during the morning. She never announced herself. She'd simply be there, sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of tea, watching. The first time she watched, I found it unsettling. The second time, I found it less so. By the 4th time, I had forgotten to notice it. She asked questions, not the usual questions. Not how long will this take, not are you sure about that technique. She asked things like, "What made you start doing this, and do you find that people understand what this kind of work is, or do they just see a tradesman?" Once she asked me whether I thought objects could carry grief. She said it seriously, without any self-consciousness, the way people ask serious things when they're past the age of worrying about sounding strange. I told her I thought they could. I told her that when I was working on an old piece, furniture, flooring, whatever it was, sometimes you could feel the weight of it, not literally, but in another way. Like the thing itself had absorbed something over the years and was giving it back out slowly. I said I knew that sounded strange. She said it didn't. I told her about Liam once. I don't know why. She hadn't asked, but we'd been talking about patience, about how restoration work required a particular kind of patience, and I said that having a kid had changed how I understood patience, because children operated on a completely different timeline than adults, and if you couldn't shift into their timeline, you'd spend years being frustrated. She asked how old he was. I said 9. She asked if he was with his mother. I said no. I said his mother had left when Liam was 2, not angrily, not as a bid for sympathy, just as a fact. She didn't offer condolences or say she was sorry. She said, "So you've been doing it on your own for 7 years." And the way she said it wasn't pity. It was more like acknowledgement, like she was noting something in a ledger. "Yes," I said. "That's not nothing," she said, and she went back to her tea. I found out later, not from her but from Estelle, that Helena and Raymond Voss had had one daughter. Her name was Audrey. She lived in Montreal now, and they had not spoken in 4 years. Estelle said it in the neutral tone of someone who has decided not to have opinions about the private matters of her employer, but the fact itself hung in the air of the room for a while after she'd said it. I didn't ask why. It wasn't my business. But I thought about it. In the 6th week, I was working on the left rear leg, finally replacing the shim properly, re-leveling it the way it should have been done years ago, when I noticed something about the bottom of the leg. There was a seam. Not a crack, a seam. Deliberate, a concealed joint, the kind a very good woodworker makes when they want something to look seamless but to be openable. I sat with it for a moment. I pressed it in the way you press things you suspect might give, and a small section of the base plate rotated. Inside was a cavity, maybe 8 centimeters deep, and in the cavity was a notebook. It was small, dark green cover, the kind you find in any stationery shop, the kind that costs $3 and come in packs of 2. It wasn't old. The elastic band holding it shut was still supple. I set my tools down and I held it and I did not open it, because it wasn't mine to open. I found Estelle in the kitchen and I showed it to her. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did something. She said she'd tell Mrs. Voss. I went back to the piano room and kept working. 30 minutes later, Helena came in. She was moving differently. Not slowly, exactly, but with less of the precision I'd come to associate with her. She had the notebook in her hands. She stood in the doorway and I stood up from the floor, and she looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Did you read it?" "No," I said. She nodded. Once. The way people nod when they're not really nodding at you but at something inside themselves. She sat down in the chair by the window. She opened the notebook. She read for a long time. The rain had started again outside, the serious October rain that doesn't stop, and the light on the water was gray and low. And she sat in that chair and read, and I went back to work on the leg because I didn't know what else to do. When she stopped, she was quiet for a long time, long enough that I looked up. She was holding the notebook closed against her chest. Her eyes were on the window. She said, "He wrote it the year before he died. I didn't know he could write like this." A pause. I didn't know he thought about things like this. I didn't ask what things. I waited. "He wrote about Audrey," she said, "about the argument, about how he thought it had been handled." Another pause, longer. "About what he wished he'd said differently." She looked at me then, and something in her face had changed in a way I couldn't entirely read. Like the city after the fire again, but in an earlier stage. Still open, still rearranging. "He hid it in the piano," she said, "because he knew I would find it eventually, when I finally had it seen to." Her voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. He knew I would never sell it. And he knew that eventually someone would get into the legs properly. I thought about Raymond Voss at 39, buying a piano to seem like a serious person. I thought about him decades later, writing things in a green notebook he couldn't say out loud, and hiding them somewhere he knew would be found. Not soon. Not while it was easy to find them. Later, when they were needed. He wasn't a man who said things, Helena said. He provided, he built, he showed up, but he didn't say things. I understood that. More than I maybe should have. She asked me if I had someone like that in my life. Someone whose silence I'd misread for a long time. I thought about my father, who had died in 2019, who had come to every one of my jobs at least once in the years before he got sick, who had stood back and watched me work and never once said he was proud of me, but had also, I found out after, told every person he knew. My uncle had told me at the funeral. A man at his curling club had told me at the funeral. My father's doctor had told me at the funeral. I said yes. I said I had someone like that. She nodded. We sat with that for a moment. The rain on the glass. The Steinway between us, slowly becoming itself again. She didn't say anything sentimental. She didn't draw a lesson out of it, and hand it to me wrapped up neatly. She just sat there and I sat there, and the piano was there and the notebook was there, and her husband was not, and that was all true at the same time. Eventually she stood and said she had some calls to make. She paused at the door. "Finish the leg today if you can," she said. "I want to hear it by Christmas." She left. I went back to the leg. I worked carefully, the way I always did because I was raised to take that kind of care, because I believed it mattered how you did a thing even when no one was watching. I refitted the base plate. I tested the level. I re-glued the veneer at the corner of the lid using the right adhesive, the kind that doesn't yellow over decades, because I intended this piano to last. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, I got a call from an unfamiliar Montreal number. It was Audrey Voss. She didn't explain how she'd gotten my number. She said, "My mother tells me you found something in the piano." Her voice was guarded, but underneath the guard there was something else, something that sounded like a person standing in a doorway, not quite in or out. I said yes. She said she called me. A pause. We talked for 2 hours, the first time we've talked, really talked, in 4 years. I didn't know what to say to that. She said, "I don't know if I should thank you or thank the piano or thank my father for being the kind of man who couldn't say things out loud." I said probably all three. She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and in it I could hear something of her mother. She said she was coming to Vancouver in December. She asked if the piano would be finished by then. I said yes. I said it would be finished and it would be in tune and it would be ready. She said, "Good." And then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "My mother told me what you said, about objects carrying grief. She said you seemed like someone who understood things." I didn't answer right away. Outside my window, Liam was at the kitchen table working on his spelling homework, his tongue pressed to his upper lip the way it was when he was concentrating. The lamp was on and the rest of the house was dark, and he looked, in that moment, like something I would want to remember. I said, "I'm not sure I understand things. I just pay attention." She said that was the same thing. Maybe she was right. The piano was finished on the 10th of December. I drove out to West Vancouver on a Tuesday morning, Liam in the back seat because his school had a PA day and I had no one to leave him with. He sat in the back and did not complain, which was characteristic of him, this kid who had been making the best of my imperfect logistics his whole life without being asked. Estelle let us in. Liam looked at the ceiling in the foyer and said, "Whoa," under his breath, and I felt something warm move through me. Helena was in the piano room. She stood when we came in and she looked at Liam with the same directness she'd looked at my hands the first day, and she said, "You must be the scrambled egg expert." Liam looked at me. I shrugged. I hadn't known she'd remembered that. He said yes. That was him. She said, "Sit down then." He sat in the chair by the window where she usually sat. She sat at the piano, and she played. I hadn't known she played. I had assumed it was Raymond who'd bought it, Raymond who'd wanted it, and that she had kept it out of loyalty or grief, or the particular stubbornness of people who don't discard what they loved. But she played. Not perfectly, not the way she might have once. Her hands weren't what they'd been, but she played something, a piece didn't recognize, slow and deliberate, with the kind of feeling in it that doesn't come from technical mastery. It comes from somewhere else. Liam sat very still. He was not a still child, but he sat still. When she finished, there was quiet except for the rain, which had started again, the way it does in December in that part of the world, softly and without any intention of stopping. Liam said, "That was really good." Helena looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the piano. Then she said to me, without turning her head, "You did good work." 3 words. From a woman who did not give them easily. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Audrey arrived Saturday." I nodded. She rested her hands on the keys, not playing, just resting, the way you rest your hands on something you've been missing without knowing it. I drove home with Liam asleep in the back seat by the time we hit the highway, the way kids fall asleep in cars, completely and without warning. The mountains were invisible behind the clouds and the rain was steady and the wipers were new. Finally, and they worked the way wipers are supposed to work, clean arcs across the glass, clearing everything in front of me. I thought about my father standing at the back of every job site, watching. I thought about what it costs a person to keep things inside for a lifetime, and what it costs the people waiting for them to say it. I thought about Raymond Voss with his green notebook and his hidden compartment and his certainty that someone, eventually, would look closely enough at what he'd left behind. I thought about the calls that don't get made, the ones we put off until next week, next month, when things settle down a little, when we know better what to say. I thought about how we convince ourselves that the silence is only temporary, that there's still time, that the other person knows, they must know. We don't have to say it out loud. Most of the time we're wrong. But sometimes someone gets into the leg properly. Sometimes someone pays attention to a seam where there shouldn't be one. Sometimes the thing you couldn't say out loud survives you anyway, folded up small in a dark green notebook, waiting for the moment when it's most needed. Liam stirred in the back seat. He said my name in the half-conscious way he had, not really awake, just checking I was still there. "I'm here," I said. He settled back into sleep. The rain kept on. The wipers kept on. The road home was clear.